Hi, this section is about the tragedy of the commons. So, what are the commons? The commons are the places that we're all allowed to go. Anyone is allowed to go, basically. And they hold great value for people and for communities. This picture here is about the announcement of the establishment of the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs on Congress Square in 1918. So it's sometimes thought of as a town square or a public square, a piazza or a plaza, an open public space commonly found in the heart of a town, used for community gatherings, can be a commons. The commons can also be a native bush in your area. In Australia, our beaches, um, places like roads are part of the commons, and public parks, libraries. All these things are part of the commons. And in the past, people were able to use the commons to gather, to hunt or gather food. And when Aboriginals lived here in Australia without any white people, the whole of Australia was part of the commons, because they didn't say, well, this part is mine, you can't come here. So what other commons do we have in the world? Well, we have online commons too. So social media is a part of the commons. Here's one about Federation Square in Melbourne and its long history, and the fact that when they designed Melbourne, they deliberately designed it without a town square because they didn't want the people making decisions. Australia's public libraries are part of the commons. It's a place where we go to share our resources. It's free. Public parks. I'm sure you have one in your neighbourhood. This article I saw this week, which was, last month, was talking about people seeking relief from the heat in the heat wave in England over the summer. But basically what this article says is that 75% of England's riverbanks are actually off limits to the public, which means they are no longer part of the commons, so they're privately owned. Here's a lovely example of sharing the commons in Victoria, in Melbourne. In fact, there's a little penguin colony. Used to be called fairy penguins, which I thought was much cuter, but now they're little penguins. And people would come to see them. They were down at St Kilda Beach, and everything was getting a bit out of hand, and it was stressing out the penguins. So the government paid for and built a way, footways, and helped the volunteers get funded and organized, and now everybody can go and see the little penguins for free, and we can share in the commons of nature. Roads take up a lot of the commons, and some cities are retaking back the centers of the cities for pedestrians, for example, because cars overtook parts of our urban spaces that belonged in the commons and belonged to people and communities. I think this is a photo or AI photo, I'm not sure, but it looks like Perth Airport or something like that, where you're on all these roads and you can't actually see where you are or where you're going. The earth is the commons, except for the parts that are privately owned. Now, Hardin came up with an idea, which he spoke to the British Parliament about, I can't remember when, but least 100 years ago, he wrote a paper called The Tragedy of the Commons, and what he was putting forward was the idea that if people are left to look after the commons, they won't. And so every piece of land, everything in the world should be privately owned because people will only look after it if they own it. This actually hasn't turned out to be the case, but that was his case put before Parliament. The story that he told was the one of the village. Everybody owns one cow and they have one field in which to graze their cows, and the grass is enough for everybody to have one cow. But if one person decided that they wanted to have 2 cows, they rationalized this, that they would double their profit and it would not really make very much difference to the commons. But if everybody then decides they want 2 cows, then it does make a difference to the commons. And the same goes with overfishing and all these other things. So we will talk about common pool resources later, but Hardin's thesis was people will only look after if it's privately owned, so everything should be privately owned. This is the tragedy of the commons. And we do see this in the world. Nobody owns the atmosphere, and we are completely making a mess of that, for example. Now, Elinor Ostrom came along and she did research in communities where there were common pool resources, and what she found was that rather than rational utility maximizing individuals coming along and just ruining the commons, if people could communicate with each other, they tended to cooperate and develop rules that limited the use of the resources and conserve the resources and conserve the natural environment. So Hardin's theory was influential, which led to central control of common pool resources, either through private ownership or through governments deciding what was and wasn't allowed to be done. Now, we saw how that didn't work very well at Pink Lake in Esperance when the government said, well, you can take X amount of salt, but they did the calculation wrong and it was not correct. And we've also seen how ineffective governments have been at moderating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for example. So governments can't necessarily control it. Private companies can't necessarily control it, but people can if they are allowed to communicate and cooperate. And if there are not too many incentives that promote self-interest. So in class, we played the Prisoner's Dilemma game. What we usually find when we play this game is that if the people are strangers to each other, they are quite likely to defect so that they make sure that they go free and they don't really care what happens to the other person. Whereas if they team up with a friend, they are very likely to trust their friend and not want to sell their friend out, and they will take a year in jail in order not to betray their friendship. So the way that we approach problem solving and decision making can very much revolve around the quality of our relationship with the other party and the trust that's involved in that relationship.